In this course, we will be discussing functional behavioral assessments, also known as an FBA. This course is intended to be an overview for school staff and general educators, counselors, principals, administrators. It is not intended to be for somebody who has advanced behavioral expertise, such as a school psychologist or a BCBA. Most of the information included in this course would likely be redundant or an overview for people who have that advanced behavioral expertise. So, a functional behavioral assessment, also known as an FBA, is a data finding process. I like to think of it as a data mining of going through and trying to collect as much information as we can in order to determine what we need to do to support a student with their behavior. In that sense, it is similar to a psych evaluation or a phonics inventory, where we're really just trying to dig deeper and understand what is going on. The goal is to be able to answer the question, what is actually happening here with this student? What is the underlying need that is not being met? What is the function that this behavior is serving? An FBA itself is not an intervention. It is a process that we go to determine if and what interventions are necessary. It does not emphasize a search for a diagnosis or even classifying the symptoms a student is exhibiting. So it's very different in that sense from a full psychological evaluation completed by a school psychologist. When we talk about an FBA, it's really important to remember that it's all based in functions of behavior. If you have not had training on functions of behavior, we highly recommend it for all school staff, whether you will be a part of the FBA process or not. Remember, functions of behavior tell us that a student's behavior is to basically do two things: to gain something or to avoid something. Then we can break it down into further categories, such as sensory, escape, connection, also known as attention, or tangible. And so, if you think about a student's behavior, you can usually start to determine, are they trying to gain attention or connection from their peers, from adults? Are they trying to gain sensory input? Similarly, you can see if a student is trying to avoid sensory input. This is super helpful because when we know the function that the behavior serves, we can determine replacement behaviors that would serve the same function but be less disruptive, more pro social behaviors. We can also determine if the student is missing skills and they need support with actually building some of these skills to not have unwanted behaviors. Why does knowing the function help? Because it allows us to match the intervention and support to the function. So, if a student is exhibiting a need for adult attention and they're trying to get it any way they can, usually in a disruptive way, we might suggest putting them into a check in, check out or a check in connect program. If they're sensory seeking, there are also interventions, scaffolds, and supports we can put in place so that they do this in a more pro social way. Breaks are better, heavy work are great examples of that. If the student, however, is peer attention seeking, a check in, check out probably wouldn't work, nor would breaks. However, partnering them with a peer mentor, a social skills group, those types of things would support peer attention seeking behavior. If a student is sensory avoidant, meaning maybe they don't like loud noises, maybe there's certain textures, temperatures, clothing. One great example in school is a cafeteria, which is very overwhelming for many students who tend to avoid sensory input. So we might use tools such as a headphone or teach them to ask for breaks and work on gradually building up the amount of time the student can build in the cafeteria. So, knowing the underlying function of the behavior is super critical so that we're not just guessing and throwing every intervention, support, and scaffold at the wall and hoping something sticks. FBAs are a really complicated and timely process right now. There has been recent guidelines from the federal government, from the state, about using FBAs. And so we really would love to break down what this might look like in your school building, because there's a couple of different versions of an FBA. The first is perceived motivation. And so, perceived motivation, for the sake of, again, universal general education, when we get into more scientific ABA practices, there are more nuances. But for the sake of today's conversation, perceived motivation is going to be the same thing as function of behavior. We are going to look for patterns over time when collecting this information. Your school's office discipline referral form should include a space for teachers to indicate what they believe the perceived motivation for this behavior was. So maybe they'll say they were trying to get out of work, or avoid a sensory task, or avoid gross motor, or seek peer attention or adult attention or whatever it is. And a lot of teachers struggle with this because they haven't had FBA training at a really deep level. But it's important to remember that when we're collecting perceived motivation through office disciplinary forms, it is just your best guess. We are not saying that this is the end all be all definite reason why a student is doing something, because what a team will do then is they'll look at all the referrals for the student over time from different teachers and educators and staff over the years, over the months, and be able to see patterns in the student behavior. So it's less about having the right answer and just more about making your best guess at the moment. And then we will compare it to all the other information we have on the student. It's really important to know that it is okay to collect this information at a tier 1 or universal level, because we're doing it for all students. So this is not something that this student is only receiving and we're adding it in and we're collecting this on just this one student, because then that would indicate this is more than a universal practice. So then what will happen with that data, those referrals, grades, attendance, is a team, usually a tier 2 team, an MTSS team, will take a look at that and make their best guess on what intervention would suit the student. So if a team gets a referral for a 4th grader named Tommy, and Tommy has 10 referrals in 3 months from 3 different teachers that he sees throughout the day, and he is exhibiting, the most of them are adult attention seeking behaviors. So then we can say maybe check in, check out would be a good place to start with Tommy. We don't know for a fact because there are a couple other things that were indicated, but the pattern over time has been adult attention seeking. So we can start by putting Tommy into check in, check out. The great thing about using perceived motivation in your data analysis is that anybody can really do this. Any MTSS, PBIS team could take a look at this. It doesn't require a school psychologist to be a part of matching the student to a tier 2 intervention. The cons, of course, are that our output is only as good as the input. So if the data we have is not accurate, if it's biased, that means that our guess as a tier 2 team is not going to be as consistent or effective. So that's the least restrictive, lowest level of analyzing function of behavior and perceived motivation. The next level is going to be known as an informal FBA. The state is moving away from using the term informal, but many of our districts are still using the term. So that's why we have included this. It's similar to the perceived motivation data analysis that we just talked about at a tier 2 level, but it might include a little bit more extra data. So we might talk to the student. There might be an observation of the student, but it's going to not necessarily go to the level of needing a parent signature or parent consent. We still, of course, believe that best practice tells us that parents should be notified if their child is in any sort of intervention or tier 2 system. So, obviously, notification of parents is really, really important. The pros of using sort of an informal FBA, again, we are going to have more people at the table with advanced behavioral expertise, but it's still consistent and accessible data mining into student behavior. The cons would be, again, that there might be a lack of consistency because it is more of an informal FBA. It's a more of an informal process. And there are always going to be concerns about validity when we're using data we already have and maybe just adding a couple of extra little things. Are we positive that it's all valid? Are we positive there's no bias or major changes that have occurred with the students that are now impacting the behavior? We don't know. So that would be the concern with an informal FBA. But by far, most of our districts believe that utilizing an informal FBA process is one that is really important for them because it requires less time and meetings. It makes the FBA process more accessible. And guidelines from the state and from the federal government have been that they want functions of behavior to be a conversation earlier in student concerns. So, an informal FBA in that sense would support that goal. The next level of FBA, which is not commonly utilized in our area, is a brief FBA. And this is essentially a formal FBA, but it's like a shortened version. So instead of focusing on the whole child and looking at a comprehensive selection of behaviors, we're going to just look at one. So it's essentially we're just cutting off all the extra stuff for the student and we're just going to focus on this one concerning behavior. In some ways, this makes sense because if you have a student with a very specific behavioral need, you might not need to look at all the other times during the day, the student concerns. Like if we know that our issue was just vaping, then we can focus there. Again, it's going to be slightly more accessible than the full FBA process, but there's a real lack of clarity on parental consent, potentially missing underlying contributing factors to the student behavior. The last and most extensive FBA, which is probably the one that most people are familiar with, is the full or comprehensive FBA. This is the optimal version, the gold standard of the FBA. It is the process that will look at the whole child, scientifically more likely to be valid. It's completed by the most qualified professionals at a building. So anybody who has behavioral expertise, a BCBA, a school psychologist, and there are very clear guidelines on requiring parental consent here, which can be a barrier at times. Some cons are simply that like it takes more resources to do. So, more time, more people, more meetings and collaboration, more expertise. A full and comprehensive FBA is going to be your best bet at really understanding what is going on with a student's behavior and then being able to develop a plan to best support them. A full or comprehensive FBA is required if a student is involved with law enforcement that has a disability. An FBA is automatically required. So that's kind of important to remember that if you're working with special education populations, a full or comprehensive FBA might be called for automatically. In the end, as a general education or a general school staff member, what's important for you to understand is that we should be considering the function of a student's behavior throughout the school process, very early on. Even if we are not committing to a full or comprehensive FBA, we can still be having discussions about perceived motivation and underlying needs that aren't being met for the student. As always, please follow your district guidelines for consent, FBA process, who should be completing this information, etc. We truly believe that your district processes and guidelines are going to be the place where you should start when asking these questions. Again, many people don't understand that the FBA itself is not an intervention. So you might need to do some education with families, with other school staff to let them know that yes, an FBA is great and we're so glad that you are requesting one. But please know that's not an intervention itself. That's a tool, a process for us to figure out which interventions would be most ideal for a student.